Hello. Hello, hello.
Alright, yeah, folks, I'm going to be reviewing a different video that includes Douglas Murray and Lionel Shriver having an interesting discussion. And then maybe we'll have some guests in the Discord if they do come on. But in the meanwhile, let's review this video.
Well, good evening.
Hi, nice to be here.
Would you like to kick off?
I will kick off. We've been scheming. As you know, we're both here to talk about identity politics. If you know anything about our work, you know we're here to talk about what's wrong with it.
Or leave now.
Yeah. In fact, we theorized that these tickets just cost just enough that our detractors won't pay for a seat. We're going to organize the evening in this manner. We'll talk a few minutes about the general phenomenon, what it is, and why we don't like it. And then we thought we'd follow the organizational structure of Douglas's new book, which is looking at 4 categories of gays, women, race, and trans. And then we're going to spend a few minutes at the end wrapping up what we both think we should do about this, what's the solution, and that's going to be the shortest part of the evening because we really have no idea.
So it's interesting to think about the different factions represented by the left and how they all sort of fall victim to the same premise. It's very difficult to resist identity politics from a foundation that doesn't have any way to say no to people who are genuinely suffering, and these people are genuinely suffering. That's one thing that you see. One of the most ineffective responses is, "Oh, they're just faking it." Well, no. There is genuine need associated with different categories of people. There is genuine distress happening. There are a lot of problems within these communities, and you need some reason to say, yes, there is suffering, but no, we can't or won't do anything about it. And the left is perpetually puzzled by the trouble that they're having with this endless multiplication of grievances. Fundamentally, the world is a place that's full of grievances, full of unfairness, and there really isn't a limit. There really isn't a time when you can say, oh, well, now I'm finished. And so, humanitarianism always has to be balanced against other things. But to say straight up that something else should take precedence over the alleviation of suffering, well, that's a bridge too far for a lot of people, even on the right. But yeah, I just remark that I'm always sort of nonplussed at the confusion that people on the left have for why they've fallen into the position that they've fallen into. If they view the identity politics thing as being a bad thing, it does follow from the premises.
The rest of the evening, of course, is going to be up to you. Half an hour, 35 minutes before we go home, it's up to you to come up with some questions, and something about this subject matter suggests to me that we're not going to run out of them. Briefly, my problem with identity politics, which I would define as a single-minded obsession with viewing everything in life, in all of human history, through the prism of the rivalry and power relationships between groups. My problem with that is that it's flattening. It's an ugly, dismal way of looking at being alive. And it's an ugly way of thinking of both the self and of other people. Those are related. We all have selves. But
Well, But is it uglier than looking at it in the other ways that it was looked at before? Like, is it uglier than looking at it in terms of class? Yeah, I mean, I agree with this. This is one of the principal problems that I have with the left, is that it boils down to identity through grievance, identity through suffering, and that's a very thin reed to hang on. But it seems to me to apply to the entire left, even before the modern identity politics thing took over. Let's see. Oh, looks like we have some people in the chat. So yeah, like it's a very dark way to look at the world in terms of grievance, but it's the way that the left has always looked at the world. And the more viable elements of the left were simply, how would I put it? They were more pragmatic, and they idealized more virtuous factions. So when you're idealizing factory workers, when you're idealizing the proletariat in the age of the Industrial Revolution, you're idolizing, hardworking people who are tough as nails and who, those of them who can politically organize as well as do their jobs. Well, they have a certain weight to them, right? So there was a power to that labor organizing, and in many ways I think that you do need to admire labor. You need to give that faction its due, and there are various schemes that I could devise to try to make sure that they have more of a share or more power over their own labor. That would make sense. But when you're talking about factions that have no such no such pragmatic value in and of themselves, well, at that point, it's still ugly, but it's also useless.
But according to identity politics, the only thing that matters about anyone here is your race, your gender, whether or not you're disabled, what your sexual preference are, and whether you're satisfied with your gender. In fact, identity politics has fractured so much that these categories of people who are implicitly pitted against each other for your sympathy are infinitely subdividing. And that's the second problem with this way of looking at the world, is that it's fundamentally adversarial. And so it pits us all against each other. And ironically, it pits us all against each other in the weirdest of spectrum.
Right. But what doesn't this apply to exactly? Oh, ultra testosterone. This is a spectator video. So I cottoned on to it. A friend of mine who's a fan of Douglas Murray sent me this video, and he's having a discussion with this Lionel Shriver gal. If anyone has any videos they'd like me to review, they can post them in the chat or in the Discord, as the case may be.
Which is who's more oppressed, who has it the hardest. It's not about becoming powerful. It is about seeing your powerlessness as your power. And that kind of inversion weirdly means that people who regard themselves as oppressed have no reason to get unoppressed, that is, to solve their problem, because their problem is their ticket, their gravy train. That's where all your power is. Weakness is power. Disadvantage is advantage. And so that we are encouraging people to embrace their own fragility and their own difficulties as the source of their.
Right. This arises from the embrace of pathology, right, as identity. So your ailments as being your identity. That makes it so that your fragility is your identity. Also, labor had a lot of things going for it, particularly your industrial workers. They had what the leftists would now call privilege in a variety of ways, and that means ultimately that they weren't forced into this world of imagining their weaknesses to be their virtues. Spacetime DCR says, class categories aren't obsolete just yet, are they? I would say no, they're not obsolete. They're different, but they're not obsolete.
Their very identity.
I don't disagree with any of this.
I don't imagine we're going to disagree on anything.
We're going to have to find something. What Lionel describes, I noticed in recent years, as beginning with the phenomenon of speaking as a. Maybe it'll even happen in Q&A later. Well, shot in the foot if you do that. But speaking as a is one of the ways in which you start to sense this movement. Speaking as a woman, speaking as, and nobody of course says speaking as a man, but speaking as a gay or speaking as a person of color and so on and so forth, is the start of this movement, which I think has been weaponized.
And so speaking as a laborer did not have all the same problems that speaking as a gay person, as a trans person, as a member of a racial or ethnic category. These have problems because they don't inherently correlate to any sort of strength, any sort of virtue. And so inevitably people who gravitate towards identifying largely based on such badly screened categorizations, badly screened for virtue, if you care about that, they're going to be relatively unvirtuous. Ultra Testosterone says, Kyle Rowland, any good apps that spoof voice? I think that you can do basic voice effects pretty easily, like anonymizing voice effects. I haven't used those, but I think that the hard thing, the expensive thing, is getting a good fake voice. But if you don't need that, then just a distortion effect should be pretty easy to do.
Politicized to an incredibly dangerous degree in recent years. I describe it in The Madness of Crowds as being like, in the last 15 years in particular, like seeing a set of rights claims, women's rights, equal rights for people, whatever their sexual orientation, equal rights for everyone, whatever their origins, as looking like seeing a train coming into a station that it was meant to arrive in at. And just as it looked like it was arriving in at the desired destination, suddenly getting ahead of steam, shooting off down the tracks, off the tracks, and then scattering people in its wake. Why, I started to wonder.
And this analogy, some would be more angry about it than others, but one objection that immediately springs to mind is just how many people were scattered by earlier left-wing movements. Many of those outside of America, but some of those within. There was a lot of social chaos that was created by left-wing movements. It's not like that started in 2010 or in the 2000s. So, like the train was already running over some people, and it had been for quite some time.
When the situation of all rights claims had never been better, were all of them presented as if they've never been worse? Why should everything have taken on this retributive manner?
Well, the worst thing that can happen to any liberation movement is getting what it wants.
Yes. Well, they become like the phenomenon we see in charities. This happens in the charitable sector. You set up a charity to deal with a particular disease. If they cure the disease, or the disease has a cure found for it, the charity always finds a way to continue. It will become.
Another objection, though, is that disease hasn't been cured, right? There still are these differences in outcome. Now, in many cases, these are inherent. So if you're talking about pathologies, if you're talking about your wealth, your disability status, then inherently the identity itself contains a difference in outcome or a claimed difference in outcome. But then also, even among those that don't, there still are these differences. There still are these differences in outcome. And so the train has not by any means reached the final station. The goal is equality. And when you're far away from equality, as these movements are all far away from equality, equality of outcome, well then, they're not going to consider that they've reached the final station, or even close. Older Testosterone asks, do you think that you need bonds in a portfolio, or is a pure equity portfolio sufficient? It depends on like risk management, basically. Like, how much risk do you want, right? Do you want to take on a lot of risk? It really just depends on your risk tolerance, right? So if I'm investing, I don't put anything into bonds because I'm not interested in that level of return, right? I'm not at the amount of money where the returns that you get from bonds are really all that interesting to me. And so that's not my bag, but yeah. Bonds are a lot less risky. Presumably, unless you're doing something weird. So they're a way to get a return, but it's a small return, corresponding to the very small risk that you're taking. As long as you don't sell the stocks at a low, you should be fine for any 5-year. No, there's no guarantee that you'll be fine, right? That's the point, is that there is a real chance of a big downside. A more serious chance than with bonds, particularly government bonds. So that's why you get paid that risk premium.
Become the charity for people who once had that disease or knew someone who had it. And because by this point pensions are involved and careers and much more. So we see the thing now there was a time, needless to say, when, for instance, gay rights groups, civil rights groups in America and so on had a point. Now, what is the point of these entities? Other than to claim that they've never been so oppressed, that it's never been worse, that everything's about to get much worse than we know. And then this strange weaponization of everybody against everyone else, so that...
Right, but not so strange to me, because these, like I said, differences still exist in these outcomes. Very big differences in outcomes between the say, suicide rates of cis people and trans people. Like, huge. So not equality of outcome. Right? Until there's equality of outcome, they have a lot of reason to be angry, as long as you're coming at things from the presumption that you should have an equality of outcome. Testosterone says, stocks have never remained down for greater than 5-year intervals in the USA. Well, you could be forced to liquidate, right? The conditions that cause a huge market crash could force you to liquidate your assets. Right? And again, it's just a question of again, your risk tolerance. You could say, well, screw it. I don't really care about that low possibility of a market crash that lasts longer than my time horizon, so screw it. And then you just don't put anything into bonds in that case. Old Testosterone asks, why don't you believe in God? Well, there's no reason to expect that there was a designer, but also the positing a designer doesn't solve the problem, right? Because then you have to ask, like, how did the designer arise? So you say, how do I explain the development of DNA on a probabilistic basis? Well, it seems like it's possible to derive it from much simpler constructs, like some sort of proto-RNA could develop into DNA. But then, trying to justify this is kind of a waste of time, because the existence of God is even harder to justify. So the higher order intelligence is itself something that's hard to explain, rather harder to explain than some molecules in a organic soup. Ultra says, to avoid that issue, you just need an emergency fund that covers that much expenses. Yeah, and that changes your yield, doesn't it, Ultra? Hey, Fletcher. Good to see you. Good to see you, bros. Bros all here. So yeah, like you say, oh, well, I'll just have an emergency fund. But that emergency fund, if it's counted as what's allowing you to invest in this way, is reducing your yield. And if at that point you still say, no, I'm still good, like it still doesn't make sense for me to invest in less risky assets in order to have less of an emergency fund, well then don't invest in less risky assets. But other people do the calculus differently. Bistam DCR says, have you seen the nanomechanisms at the lowest level of biological matter? Yeah, I've seen those animations. They can be kind of misleading in the sense that they show like a deterministic sequence, whereas in fact, if you looked at it, it would be like wiggling back and forth and then like crawling like through almost a random walk, a biased random walk towards the right direction. But yeah, it is absurdly complex. But that complexity can be built up from a very simple basis over time. And you can say that story is implausible, but implausible relative to what?
The gays are used against the straights, and the women against the men.
And the trans.
The trans against everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Ultra, we're not talking about the development of DNA from nothing. We're talking about the development of DNA from some proto-DNA structure, like some sort of RNA but more basic structure, right? We're not talking about the spontaneous assembly of a DNA molecule. And again, you haven't answered the question. Sure, you can say this is very improbable, but what's your explanation for the intelligence? Right? How did that assemble itself? Ultra says it's all faith. No, it's just like it's trying to reason without a cop-out, because God is a cop-out. Unless you're going to justify the existence of God on a similarly granular level, then I'm trying to justify the existence of life arising from a chemical soup. He says that's why I'm agnostic and not atheist. Well, there's just no particular reason to believe. Like nothing you've said makes the God explanation any more compelling, because you have the problem that I have in terms of saying how DNA arose times a billion for saying how the God arose. That's the problem, right? It's not an argument that holds water.
Yes.
I mean, just total war. And people of different racial backgrounds against each other, so that we now see, and we'll get on to this, but we now see the epithet white and all of these derivations
Which
of
is
that.
pejorative.
Solely pejorative.
Right, white is a pejorative, rich is a pejorative, first world is a pejorative. Essentially, success is a pejorative in the modern world because of the leveling philosophy behind our politics and our morality. Ultra says, you have no abiogenesis explanation using existing biology that has been observed in nature. And would we expect there to be such signatures if that had occurred? I can point to lots of things that I would expect if there had been an intelligent designer. I don't see them. Mikey Mike, how's it going?
Good. Can you hear me?
Yeah, your mic is kind of bad, but it's okay.
Yeah, I don't know what I'm doing. I just downloaded the app on my trip, but we'll try to get it to work.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So you're on the phone.
There's feedback 'cause I had it on the Bluetooth.
Oh, that got way better suddenly. Suddenly it was 100 times better.
Yeah, I turned my car. Yeah, what's going on? I've been enjoying the Fuentes drama. I actually was listening to some of it. He's so cringe, but he's kind of like OV, right? Like he's so cringe, but he can be. And he insults every group of people. It's not just the Holocaust. It's like Native American, gay
Right.
people, blacks,
But you might
He
want to go into
basically
your
was going
Discord
to have an
settings
army of
and
people.
and make it so that the push to talk delay is set to like 200 milliseconds because or just let go of the key a little bit later than you normally do because it does cut you off at the end of your sentence for some reason. He's definitely amusing, but I do get the sense that he's more serious about the JQ than he is about other matters. I haven't seen him quote unquote joke about other matters with the same vigor. But have you? In your experience, is he just as vigorous in his jokes about other groups? Spacetime DCR says some of the complex mechanisms work as a whole compound, but their individual parts are useless. This makes those built up from smaller parts hypothesis wrong. Well, no, we see lots of things that are built up from smaller parts, where we can still see the signature left in that structure of the fact that it came from these smaller basic parts. But once you but often what will happen is once the thing is assembled, those edges will be smoothed away. So we'd expect there to be times when we can tell what the more basic parts are that led to the construction of the thing, and times when we can't. Fletcher says the JQ is a purity test for many dissident writers, proof of authenticity. I agree. It's the center of the onion, as this fellow put it. What's that guy? Innuendo Studios. This guy has some interesting takes. He's kind of a far lefty, but he has some interesting takes, and here's one of them.
Say for the sake of argument, your friend Gabe is starting to worry you. Gabe's always been just, a regular guy, not very political. He likes video games, comics, Star Wars, and anime. White guy shit. The only offbeat thing about him is you suspect there's like a 20% chance he's a furry. For all intents and purposes, Gabe is a normie. But recently, Gabe's been spending a lot of time on some radically conservative forums and listening to radically conservative podcasts and picking some radically conservative arguments with you and your friends. You never would have expected this, not from Gabe. And given the speed it's happened, it's worrying to think where it might be headed. How have the alt-right gotten their hooks into...
Spacetime says there'd be no reason for those smaller parts to evolve. Well, sure there would. Right? Like, how do you know that there's no reason for the smaller parts to evolve? You can have a bunch of smaller building blocks that happen to have a possible configuration that's even more positive for fitness, and then they combine, and then their old legacy features either remain visible or don't, just depending on what's practical.
Your friend. If you've ever known a Gabe, this video's for you. Here's how to radicalize a normie. Step 1, identify the audience.
Anyway, the point that I was looking for was the onion metaphor. Here it is.
Birtherism, Sandy Hook truth, useful for onboarding people so he won't denounce them. At the same time, nobody takes those manosphere betas seriously. And this process is reiterated with every pill swallowed. Gender essentialism, autogynephilia, birtherism, Sandy Hook truth, Pizzagate, QAnon if he's really out there. The heart of the onion is typically the Jewish question, but these can happen in any order and in any number. But each layer sells itself as being finally the ultimate truth. Each denies the validity of the others. The layers ahead, they don't exist, and you are certainly not being directed towards them. They're just the fevered imaginations of overreacting liberals, while the people behind are asleep, where you are now awake. That's why they chose the red pill as their metaphor. Take it, and everything will be revealed. That's why it cozies up with conspiracism. But what's supposed to follow is that this knowledge help Gabe in some way.
Oh, by the way, Mike, are you on your phone?
Yeah, I'm...
Yeah, your audio cuts off. So you should lower your detection threshold if you're using voice detection, or you should make it so that your push to talk has a delay. That's in the Discord settings, because your sentence is cut off like halfway. And I'm listening to a video, which I could link, but if you're on the phone, then it doesn't really work. I'll try to find a way later on to stream
I got you. All right,
my desktop audio.
Let me look at these.
Yeah. But yeah, this onion metaphor that the Innuendo Studios guy brings up, yeah, I think he has a point there. You do see this progression through layers, and the final layer, or the most authentic, or the most resonant layer, seems to be the JQ for this kind of conspiracy group, or just conspiracy theorists more generally. Yeah, and yeah, he says gender essentialism is a conspiracy. Yeah, so reality is a conspiracy to a devoted enough leftist, but nevertheless, one can have some insights. More stuff about irreducible complexity. Go ahead, Starman.
I don't agree that it's fully onion shaped for the sites he mentions. He mentions image boards as being distributing this onion, and it's not really like that. They'll hit you with the JQ right away if you go there.
Right, image boards will front load, but then there's also even there's an element where you think that the later layers are parodic until you're there, right? So they'll be talking, and I think that it's also changed over time, so that now the image boards, people have progressed through these stages, enough of them that the community is just talking about the final stage all the time. But back in the day, I remember, yeah, like people were talking about the JQ, but they weren't. It wasn't clear whether they were serious, and there were lots of other things that they were talking about where it was clear that they were serious. And so there is that element that I think this lefty guy describes. Aronami Hood says, I thought the final layer was NASA. Yeah. The final layer is everything's a hologram, and there are evil elves, clockwork elves, behind the scenes, where you can see with DMT.
And it doesn't. Blaming immigrants doesn't actually fix the economy, and hating women doesn't make men less lonely. But having been alienated from everything outside the onion, once that sinks in, the only recourse on offer is to seek out the next pill. And pills are easy to find. Those within the network have laissez-faire relationships, even if they on paper disavow one another. When they need a source or a guest host, they aren't going to go to the left. They're going to feature each other. The left is the enemy. Their ideas are beneath consideration, and the only reason to engage them is for public humiliation. But you can interview a Western...
Pretty funny that Joe Rogan was in that, or is in that bunch of examples, because he has lefties on all the time, and he himself is not a right winger, but that's like the vision through the looking glass. It's purity spiraling, right? We don't see a lot of that on this channel or on Luke Ford, but the left does suffer from the same sort of purity spirals that you see on the right, where everything is ultimately it's like fascist, good guys. Yeah. Spacetime DCR says, it's interesting to look at the social function that these fringe ideologies serve for their believers. Watch a flat earth stream and you notice many of the features you'd find in an alt-right stream. Yeah, they're largely drawing from the same audience, disaffected and conspiratorial people. And so, yeah, for different levels of sophistication and devotion, there are different levels of delusion.
Chauvinist, and that doesn't mean you're endorsing him. Just, it's fine to hear him out. Nothing should be off limits in the marketplace.
The camaraderie, the secret knowledge, the victimhood, yeah, and a lot of that applies to the left as well, where they have their version of putting on the glasses from They Live, where they put on the glasses and then it's right-wing conspiracies everywhere. All of this, even Joe Rogan is an attempt to smuggle fascism into the discourse. Joe Rogan has some very right-wing guests. He also has some very left-wing guests.
Of ideas. Besides, Nazis are apolitical. And because these...
And by the way, has anyone seen like the Sargon interview? Like that went really badly, I think, the Sargon-Joe Rogan interview. And they're supposedly both part of this enterprise, but Joe Rogan was constantly lambasting Sargon, as I recall.
Folks keep showing up in each other's metadata. Regardless of what they say, Google thinks there is definitely a relationship between the guy just asking questions and the guy denying the Holocaust. Gabe is softly exposed to many flavors of conservatism, just slightly more radical than he is now, and is expected, at the very least, to not question their presence. This is an environment where de-radicalizing, listening to the left, would...
Yeah, Fletcher, the left at this point really hates the idea of marketplace of ideas. They hate the idea of a marketplace, but then marketplace of ideas, that's just, well, it's not something to be desired.
be sleeping with the enemy. But radicalizing further, you do you, buddy. Gabe's emotional journey, however, is somewhat more complex. If you spend any time reading or watching reactionary media, you've probably noticed it's really fucking repetitive. It's a few thousand phrasings of the same handful of arguments, like there's only so many jokes about attack.
Yeah, I think that a lot of this it's very atypical for people to be able to see things from the other side. Very atypical for people to be able to understand the appeal of the other side. So, even among people who are very good analysts, they repeatedly find themselves shocked at how their enemies aren't filled with distaste at how terrible they are. Right? That's not how people are. They don't see themselves as the bad guys, and they don't. What's repetitive to you? It's repetitive to you because you don't see the merit in it. You see it as a bunch of lies and a bunch of fraud, essentially. But people who see it as being correct are going to like it in the same way that you would like people who are making the same argument in different ways for leftism.
Helicopters. But these people just crank out content, and most of it's derivative. The reason to pick one personality over another isn't because they say something different, but because they say it differently.
And yeah, a lot of these things apply to the left as well. Let's see, there was another thing that was interesting that this guy had. What was it? Oh yeah, maybe it was this.
I have suspicions that some of the claims I make in Always a Bigger Fish, that conservatism isn't at its core about fiscal responsibility, limited government, or the rights of the individual, but is about maintaining social hierarchy.
Oh, Grinder Greg Johnson got arrested in Finland. Oh, I had heard about that. Yeah, apparently he was set to give a talk. Was it Finland or Norway? I thought it was in Norway or Sweden or something like that. One of the Nordic countries, I thought. Yeah, he was set to give a talk about immigration or something like that to some forum, and they were like, no, we don't want you here. And that's what's happening to the alt-right everywhere, right? The same thing happened to Spencer in Hungary all those years ago. Aaron Ahimud says repetition is key to learning. Yeah. Nevertheless, he would have a point if he would have a point, but I think that his impression largely comes from him condensing down these arguments to something more caricatured.
That it believes people are fundamentally unequal and likes the free market because it sorts people according to their worth, and even softly implies capitalism itself may be innately anti-democratic, might raise some eyebrows. So I'm going to show my work on is capitalism.
So look at the precepts he has here. Maintaining social hierarchies. People are fundamentally unequal. Capitalism good, democracy bad. Yeah, pretty spot-on analysis in my opinion. Don't know if anyone else disagrees.
Itself may be innately anti-democratic, might raise some eyebrows. So I'm going to show my work on this one. Two of the architects of conservative thought were Edmund Burke and Joseph de Maistre, who formulated much of their political theory while writing about the French Revolution. They, in turn, were influenced by earlier writings from Thomas Hobbes on the English Civil War. And what all three of these men were doing in writing about these wars was defending the monarchy. The sentiment that the masses should be powerless in the face of nobility was being challenged. And while these men thought the revolutionaries themselves were actually quite compelling, the democracy they were fighting for, Hobbes, Burke, and de Maistre found repulsive. Come the end of the revolution, when it seemed democracy might actually spread across Europe, Burke especially began to hypothesize ways that one's position within the aristocracy might be preserved even should the monarchy fall. He turned his eye to the market. So, okay, around the cusp.
And this is where Innuendo Studios is the most interesting to me, is where he's now analyzing philosophical underpinnings of the right, and a lot of the time he hits his mark. Hey, anonymous professor, good to see you. Haven't seen you in a while. Good to see you back. By the way, anyone, including anonymous professor, can join my Discord and talk or not if they like. There it is. There's a link.
Cusp of the 19th century, the prevailing economic theories were those of Adam Smith, who championed what's called the labor theory of value, which I don't super want to get into because there's like a billion videos about it already, but really briefly, if you take materials out of the ground and turn them into useful goods, it is that labor that makes the good more valuable than the raw material. And when someone buys that good, they cover the cost of the materials plus the value your labor has added to them.
Right. And the missing piece here might be, the value of your good is determined by its scarcity. So you just can't ignore that part of it. And so using that sort of logic, you can determine capital to be a scarce thing, which equally deserves, on the basis of its scarcity and usefulness, to be remunerated.
In contrast with this, what Burke argued was, well, a lot of nebulous things, but among them that, in fact, when a person of means buys a good, that, rather than the moment the good is produced, is when value is bestowed upon it. Value is not dictated by the producer, but by the consumer. Now, there's 2 centuries of argument about this. We're not going to dig into it all, but obviously this is in some sense true. If the people with money don't want to buy a good at a certain price, eventually the price will come down. So price is not solely dictated by labor. But what Burke does is claim that price and value are the same thing. No one ever gets cheated,
Well, prices are a way of estimating value, and they're the best way that we have. So I don't think that anyone actually argues that price is a perfect determination or is a perfect one-to-one correlation with real value, whatever that may be. For instance, when you buy a car that has an explosive under the hood that's meant to assassinate the person who drives it, you're paying a certain price, but the actual value of the car to you is very low, highly negative. Such circumstances exist. Prices are a guess, but they're the best guess we have.
never gets a good deal. Whatever the buyer pays for the thing, that's what the thing is worth. Your labor is only as valuable as the degree to which it satisfies the desires of the moneyed classes.
Right, and the moneyed classes are working people, largely, right? And that's the majority of the purchasing. This is going on by people who work for a living. The worker, the poor alienated worker.
This was Burke's nod to the fact that, within capitalism, the wealthy held outsized influence, being that the more money you had, the more value you could dictate. And he argued that this was moral, that the wealthy deserved this influence. Burke was, by the way, wealthy. Sort of. He had a royal pension. What he felt the French Revolution revealed was not that oppressive nobility was bad, but that France must have just had the wrong nobles, because a proper aristocracy wouldn't have been overthrown. The problem was, as we've discussed, not the hierarchy itself, but the wrong people being in power. The revolution...
Right, which is a very sensible way to think. And if you thought this way, then... if you think this way, then you're not going to be surprised by all these events that the left is so surprised by when people with the best of intentions somehow end up committing some rather atrocious crimes.
Had taught him that perhaps power should not come by birthright. Perhaps we needed a system whereby those deserving of power could prove their worth. This should ideally be war, but capitalism would suffice. The structure of royalty would continue to exist, simply derived by different means, because the structure of democracy, where on election day the nobleman has no more power than the commoner, was, to an aristocrat, profane. What the structure needed was some tinkering to make it democracy-proof. So that's Burke. Over the next century, democracy did, in fact, spread across Europe, and Burke's, and several others, theories of value were picked up and iterated on in what came to be known as the marginal revolution, by economists Karl Menger, Stanley Jevons, and this Valjean-looking motherfucker Leon Walras. Marginalism amped up the idea that it is a good's utility to the consumer and not the worker's labor that gives it value, which confers a unique power upon those with money, and brought this thinking into a post-monarchical world. Their theories became especially popular when people realized they could be used to rebut Marxism. Jevons was taught all over Europe, and Menger became core to the Austrian school. And by the time we get to the Austrians, this mass of theories has, somewhere after Burke and before Hayek, coagulated into what we know of today as conservatism. These are among the most influential thinkers in conservative thought, and they're in a direct lineage with Burke and de Maistre. Now, while Burke is called the father of modern conservatism, these boys are not the alpha and omega of early conservative thought. But their ideas helped form the basis of conservatism and have never gone away. If you can point to some paradigm shift in the history of conservatism where the royalist sentiments of Edmund Burke and Joseph de Maistre were rooted out, I'd love to hear about it, because I listen to the thinkers championed by conservatives throughout the ages, and I keep hearing the same thing, that humans are innately unequal, and society flourishes when power is doled out to the deserving. Friedrich Nietzsche.
Right. An excellent summary, and it's the set of values that you're forced into pragmatically. So all the leftists who try to, rise above this end up having to recognize it in a still deeper and more primal way, because this is reality. Right? The Soviet Union wants egalitarianism, but ends up having to treat its leader like a god. Hey, your sound is screwed up.
Because this is reality. Right? The Soviet Union wants egalitarianism, but ends up having to treat its leader
Your sound is screwed up. You're playing the stream back, and there's like some beeping going on. All right, I'll just you're muted for now, Mike. Let me know if you've gotten your sound figured out.
Deserving. Friedrich Nietzsche was not a conservative, but was deeply influential on the early marginalists, and he claimed the purpose of society was to produce the handful of great men who created everything that made life worth living, believing, quote, only the most intellectual of men have any right to beauty, to the beautiful. Only in them can goodness escape being weakness. James Fitzjames Stephen, who wrote a book-length rebuttal against early progressivism, believed, quote, to obey a real superior, to submit to a real necessity and make the best of it in good part, is one of the most important of all virtues, a virtue absolutely essential to the attainment of anything great and lasting. Hayek and Schumpeter believed, respectively, that, quote, the freedom that will be used by only one man in a million may be more important to society and more beneficial to the majority than any freedom that we all use, and, quote, what may be attained by industrial or commercial success is still the nearest approach to medieval lordship possible to modern man. He's saying it's a good thing, by the way. Need I mention Ayn Rand's belief that, quote, the man at the top of the
Right. Even closer to lordship might be rule over the Soviet Union, or being a general in the Red Army. And that's a good thing. If that weren't true, then the Soviet Union would not have survived its many stresses.
intellectual pyramid contributes the most to all those below him, but gets nothing except his material payment. The man at the bottom, who left to himself, would starve in his hopeless ineptitude, contributes nothing to those above him, but receives the bonus of all their
True.
brains. The godfather of neoconservatism, Irving Kristol, echoing Burke's yearning for a good war, felt the hierarchy should extend beyond the borders of a single country, believing, quote, what's the point of being the greatest, most powerful nation in the world and not having an imperial role? And modern conservatives love
True.
the natural hierarchies of Jordan Peterson, who believes, quote, we keep behaving as though conservatism is
And this guy is so snarky. I love it.
disdain for equity isn't there, or if it is, that it's new. But it's been there since the beginning. Conservatism upholds the status quo and defends the powerful, first from democracy, then from communism, now from social justice. Conservatism has rallied every time a movement has tried to share power with the disadvantaged. They were against same-sex marriage, they were against giving women the vote, they were against freeing slaves. Note, I said conservatives, not Republicans. Do your research. Conservatives say, we are the party of measured steps, of caution, of evolution over revolution. And that's usually just before they say, but now is the time for swift, decisive action. Most every Republican claims to be a break with tradition. This time, we're gonna flip the script, bend the rules, outspend Democrats, invade your privacy, and start a war with no exit strategy. And that's what they've always said. All that changes is which...
Wait a minute. You can't identify starting a war with no exit plan with conservatism, my dude. Sorry. That's not what you get to do. If you look at things across history, the revolutionaries are the one who start these wars with far more frequency. Not that that's a bad thing necessarily, but that is a fact. Like the war, the propensity for revolutionaries to start wars is rather higher than that of conservatives. Unsurprisingly.
which continent the war is on. I'm not going to say the slow, stodgy conservative doesn't exist, but it is
I
never
think he's
typified
onto
the party.
something by saying that
It's
conservatism always defends the powerful, but he's using it in the wrong way because it seems just to speak to something more primal about the sort of old nomadic culture versus the urbanite culture in that sense.
Let me finish the video and then we'll discuss more. But that's an interesting point.
Character they bring out to contrast themselves with whenever they need to rally their reactionary base. They tell us that's what their party is like, and we just take their word for it. I don't feel the need to pretend that just because most democracies have a left wing and a right wing, that both are equally valid and moral. There is no rule that proves this. There's only the liberal sentiment that saying otherwise is poor sportsmanship, a standard the right does
Agreed.
not hold itself to. Conservative
Oh, disagreed. The right often holds itself to that ridiculous standard.
Conservatism is a reactionary politics that has at best mixed feelings about democracy, where my biggest issue with liberalism is that it's ill-equipped to deal with the problem of conservatism and does not fully commit to its own democratic principles. I'm going into all of this not because
And who does fully commit to democratic principles? The communists?
I want to stick it to the people who insist I don't research my videos, although I a little bit do, but because we can't talk about the alt-right if we keep portraying them as a break with the conservative tradition. They are the conservative tradition, only more. There's nothing they believe that conservatives don't have a long history of being sympathetic towards. They're just usually more ambivalent about it. As I've said before, this is...
Well, the place where they break is where they whine about how oppressed they are because of how... they whine about the oppression of the working class, right? There's a break, right? They're taking on elements of the left, trying to create a sort of national socialism type thing. Sound familiar? And that is an element of the left. That socialism, that workers' orientation, that attack on the merchants, that attack on the bourgeois, that's the left.
Is ultimately my interpretation of history, and while many experts agree with me, I am not an expert. But I do my homework. So, tell you what, I've made a post on Tumblr listing all the books, essays, and documentaries I'm consuming for this series, the ones I have lined up, the ones I've completed, and some notes on what I found valuable in them. I'm going to treat this as a living document and add to it as the work continues. Not that the people who say I just make shit up ever read the show notes, but I will keep a link in the show notes of every video, so if you want to check my work or research alongside me, you can do that. I have also live tweeted several books, including the primary source for this and the previous video, The Reactionary Mind by Corey Robin, under the hashtag Ian Live Tweets His Research. So if you want a play-by-play of an entire book complete with my own observations, that's where you can find it. So far, in addition to Robin, I've done Bob Altemeyer's The Authoritarians, Jason Stanley's How Propaganda Works, and one weird essay on Lara Croft I did for the Fury Road video. If you want to read more about the history of conservative philosophy, in addition to The Reactionary Mind, I recommend No Law for the Lions and Many Laws for the Oxen is Liberty by Elizabeth Sandifer in the essay collection Neo-Reaction of Basilisk. Elle recently got some grief from Nazis, so maybe consider buying her excellent book. Going forward, if anyone comments that I clearly don't know anything about conservatism, I hope you will stand with me in not taking them too seriously, unless they demonstrate having done at least some research. Because I do mine.
Okay, great. So you were saying, Starman, or anyone else who has comments on this video?
I think there's more something fundamental to conservatism versus whatever form progressivism takes, and just that progressivism arises starting from the cities in terms of human culture. I think the way you would look at that is how things like it starts with prostitution or just lowering of sexual norms when people transition from nomads to moving in cities because the lifestyle change demanded that as well.
I think that it does relate to the rural-urban divide. But that being said, I don't think that the ideologies inherently cut across that divide necessarily, because, like you see, there's a lot of populism that arises from rural areas, like, for example, peasant revolts, right? That would be a contradiction of this. The peasant revolts are identified with the left as we're construing it now.
Yes, they do have that connection to the left in terms of just concern over not having enough food, usually food or other material goods. I just think that if you want to paint a broad history of conservatism, it's always sort of based in these sort of nomadic thinking roots, even if it's not always necessarily from the rural area. It'll be based on what nomads or rural people think like, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Hmm. Well, yeah, I'm just not sure. What do you think about like the broader point about rural versus urban, which seems to me just to be about the expansion um, of 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 viable ways of living and viable philosophies, right? An expansion almost without limit. Is that a good way to just talk about it from the ground up? That rural urban divide.
I think it's not so much about ways of living because usually it's just one way of living, but that way of living that changes also brings with it a bunch of consequences that probably
I
won't
don't
intend
think
at
it's
first.
one way of living. I think that urban living opens up a whole bunch of different things that you can do. That's completely radically at odds with the simplicity and predetermined paths of rural life. Um, yeah, I think that rural life is much more prescribed than urban life.
Yeah, it does have lifestyles, but all those lifestyles are in a city where you have some kind of apartment or small household usually. You have generally some kind of fixed hour job. Those things tend not to change, the style of education, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Right. I might look through more of this guy's videos. Do people like that idea? I might do it anyway. Uh, I find his work pretty interesting. I think that most of it, though, the ones that I found the most interesting were about conservatism. Here, okay, maybe this.
Yes, it's all for them. All your wrongs will be redressed. Yes, it's all for them. Someone's got to be oppressed. Yes, it's all for the best.
Say, for the sake of argument, you've got this friend. You know, that one friend, you were buddies in high school but don't really see each other anymore except online, and you used to argue about politics for fun when you were teenagers, but as you've gotten older, you've drifted further left and he's gone sharply right, and your arguments...
Oh, by the way, I haven't been seeing chat, so that I thought that the chat was just dead because my chat was not refreshing. Okay, what have I missed? Not a professor is saying stuff. Other people are saying stuff. What's going on? Anonymous professor says white pride is something that will become more legitimate in the future as numbers decline. I mentioned white shift a few months ago. It's kind of legit. I think that you're going to see more identification with white as whites become a minority. But I don't think that the process is going to be as radical or as rapid as some are suggesting. Some Nick Fuentes talk. Now, Professor, how can there be an explicitly white political movement when white people are a minority? Yeah, what seems to have happened in Latin American countries is more implicit politicking. More Fuentes attacks. Does Milo do anything anymore? He used to be great and do great interviews on the BBC. Yeah, Mike, I think he was ruined by that Joe Rogan interview where he talked about abuses in the gay community, particularly of younger boys, and at that point that kind of destroyed him. I think at the best of times he was kind of oriented towards partying and having a good time, but then that scandal and him getting kicked out of CPAC gave him an excuse to kind of tumble down into relative inactivity. I think that if he had carried on full steam with content creation, he still would have been a much bigger force.
It's the Holocaust and child rape, the two most taboo subjects that will destroy people.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, yeah. It's certainly a lightning rod. By the way, your mic is good, Mike.
Okay, yeah, I'm back on my computer, so.
Excellent.
It was
Excellent.
it was an Amber Alert that caused that whole commotion. You ever have that shit go off?
Yeah.
The Amber Alert that makes your phone go crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, annoying. Okay, cool. Did you see the Innuendo Studios video at all, or not?
When you were just playing? No, I was kind of driving, so I didn't really see it much.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Yeah. But I was just mentioning earlier, I went through some Fuentes videos, and I don't know, they're cringy but entertaining. The, I'm a big fan of Christopher Columbus Day, because supposedly we're not supposed to celebrate it anymore, which makes me want to celebrate it. But he had a funny video on that
Mm-hmm.
that was just as offensively as possible, promoting why Christopher Columbus is awesome, which was just really entertaining to me.
Yeah.
So here he is, like 15% Native American or whatever, talking about how like the Native Americans never did shit. It's just, I don't know,
Right.
it's a spectacle.
Well, he's pretty much appealing to the white nationalist crowd, right? As far as I can tell. So, the white nationalist crowd will happily welcome people who will say things like that, particularly if they're woke on the JQ, and it won't matter that they're like they have an attitude that everything else can wait. Really, what needs to be focused on is the primary grievance that they have. And yeah, like it is entertaining, but the downside to that kind of attitude has proven itself to be astonishingly large, right? Like all the caricatures that were laid out against the alt-right turned out to be basically spot on. They were antisocial in exactly the way that they were called out as being antisocial, and that's not survivable. There needs to be a way to have people make objections that are valid without it turning into this sort of train wreck.
I mean, I agree, but he's not going to be able to get in the CPAC. He's not going to be able to get anywhere near any of the high up Republican apparatus. But I think on the plus side, asking these politicians or Charlie Kirk some tough I mean, some of the questions are just trolling, but some of them I think are legitimate questions. Even about Israel, and I think they should have better answers than they do. So
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't think so. Frankly, I think that they're in a position of having to manage manage a lot of different interests and respond to things that they're not up to speed on. And why should they be? They're very niche issues for a very niche community. So I can respond off the cuff to these questions, but I wouldn't expect them to necessarily be able to. And frankly, Charlie Kirk was able to pretty well, as far as I could tell. Like the
I
notion.
saw Crenshaw today.
Yeah.
So somebody like him should be able to answer.
Yeah, he pretty much just said, "I understand that underneath your question is something else, and I'm going to respond to that instead of the question." And he was right. The questions are not, straight up. There's something underneath them that they're meant to imply, and he can reply to that even if he doesn't know the specific answer to that question. It's like if I ask you, why is it that this picture of Neil Armstrong on the moon is overexposed relative to what it should be, given the illuminance of the sun at that distance? And you could just be like, I don't believe in moon landing hoax conspiracy theories, and that's a general response. You don't need a specific response necessarily, right? You have to be educated on the specifics of that issue.
Yeah.
Ultra.
Well, he knows. He knew that he's going to get bombarded by this crowd, so that's really what he was responding to. But
yeah, I mean, he's vaguely aware of it, but I don't think the people are nearly as educated as they should be on these factions. They tend to act like, well, it's just some internet stuff, but it really is a big deal. Like as I said before, instead of saying, "Oh, it's just online," you should say, "Oh, it's just in real life." The internet reaches to every individual on the planet almost at this point, and so that's the network that matters at the moment. Why doesn't Nick Fuentes have a wife and kids? Well, he's young yet. Ultra testosterone. Give him some time.
21, yeah.
Kane Marco says Milo could become relevant if he went through a gay conversion program. Disavow. Yeah, but he does talk about that. He does talk about how he would rather not be gay. Doesn't seem to have helped him much with the alt-right crowd. Space DCR says you can justify doing. Go ahead.
I was going to ask you, do you want to see Fuentes banned from Twitter or anything like that, or no?
I don't really care. I'm not going to angle for anyone's ban. Let's see.
Because some people have called for that or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, people have called for the banning of pretty much everyone conservative, or anyone right wing from Twitter, and anyone far left from Twitter. So yeah, not a surprise to me. I think it's definitely odd that Fuentes and Spencer stick on, while people like Gavin McInnes are off, and Laura Loomer are off. Obviously there are specific policy issues there, but still, I think it's quite a spectacle.
Yeah, it's kind of strange. The people that are on versus get kicked off, but
Fletcher asks, do you think that Crenshaw answered the question about demographics adequately? I think it was, first of all, I'll say it was a good answer. I think he answered it well. Was it an ideal answer? No. Could an ideal answer have been given under those circumstances? Probably not. My ideal answer would be different, but it would not contradict Crenshaw's answer. Crenshaw basically said, these are citizens, these are our countrymen. We're not going to lie to them, and we're not going to abuse them, and we're gonna make our case to them. And that's good. Now, in terms of the relevance of immigration, he's already anti-immigration, so he doesn't need to justify that any more than he already has. But I would flesh that out more. I would say, yeah, it's true that people who are immigrating have different values than the people in the country, and these different values are reflected not only in their voting patterns, but also in the way that they live their lives. And there are different outcomes that correlate with these different places, and so it does make sense to be picky about where you take your immigrants from. That's a statement that I would make. Is it a statement that I would make in the face of someone who's trying to get these people kicked out of the country or turned into second-class citizens or any of that? No, right? That's not the thing to emphasize at that time. Oh, the honest professor wants a wrench. Here you go. Boom. Wrenched.
pretty decent. I suppose he deserves a wrench.
He's pretty based. I think he bought my microphone. All those many months ago. Yeah, thank you, anonymous professor.
So what are you looking forward to coming up? That Roger Stone trial starts this week, I believe. That could be kind of a spectacle.
Oh, yeah. I'm not sure how that's going to go. That's another one of those headaches that has largely receded with the end of the Mueller investigation. But still, there are aftershocks of it. It is, a really, I don't know. At this point, it can be regarded in large part as an own goal on the part of the Trump administration to let this go as far as it did. Given that we now know that it was not a prosecution, which was going for, declaring him guilty no matter what. A lot of steps could have been taken differently. Basically, he antagonized the intelligence community, such as it is, and then ultimately had to stand at their mercy anyway. Fletcher says, I just mean demographic change will have a non-negligible effect on our politics. Yeah, and I think it'll be a negative effect. I'll say that straight up. I think that people can say that straight up. But that doesn't mean that you can say that your fellow citizens are not your fellow citizens. It doesn't mean that you can be a white nationalist who denies the right of Americans to this country and to the protections and the obligations and the benefits of being a citizen. So I can oppose demographic change without invalidating the worth, the humanity, and the citizenship of my countrymen. But it seems that many people can't. Right? It seems like many people are unable to separate those things. I know that's not what you're saying, Fletcher, but that is what is being said by the people who are asking the question. So it's not what you're saying, but it's in the air.
Wow, Kyle rolling on the record against race war.
Yep.
Stance.
Bold, yeah. Fletcher says, I just wish conservatives would stress the assimilation point. Yeah. Sure. Like, that's a reason to have less immigration, is the assimilation problem, is the places cropping up around the country that don't speak English, whether that be these Chinese enclaves or these Spanish-speaking enclaves. Yeah, That's something to talk about. And I think that they do talk about it. And they could talk about it more. But the Fuentes faction makes that difficult. Not that it's the Fuentes faction specifically more than the just broader white nationalist community.
I don't think you can keep saying that they have to balance these two sides, because they wouldn't be here at all if it weren't for Trump, and Trump was the one who disregarded so many social norms as he did so.
Yeah, but Trump was not running a white nationalist campaign, right? Not even running a campaign that dog whistled the white nationalists, and it would be very different if he was. So yeah, there are social taboos that you can break. There are social taboos that you can break, but the one around white nationalism isn't one of them, and there's a very good reason for that, because white nationalism aims to destroy the lives of, probably a majority of the country, because it's not just people who are non-white, but it's also people who have relationships that are important with non-white people. So yeah, it's a really disastrous move. It's a really disastrous philosophy, and people see that, right? They're primed to see it. It's exactly the problem that the left says is characteristic of the right. So they're not going to miss it when it's there. Kane Marco says, the end justify the means. How can we accelerate the demise of conservatism, Inc., and usher in one-party scenario, thus making the system easier to topple? That's accelerationism, Kane Marco. And accelerationism is ill-fated. I'll just say that. Make it worse so it gets better, usually not a good strategy. Usually ends very badly. Fletcher says, I don't see anything like the 1924 moratorium being feasible. We need something on par with that to solve the current situation. Well, there's no solution to the situation. There's just management of it. There's no end all the problems. They just make the problems as mild as possible. Manage them as well as possible.
That seems like a point in favor of accelerationism if there is no solution.
Well, accelerationism is just make it worse and then hope that it magically gets better. But it's not going to magically get better, right? The floor is so much worse than what the accelerationists can imagine. They think that it's bad now. This is heaven compared to what it could be.
It's not going to magically get better, but it is going to fall to the floor eventually, and that's where you at least have the chance to build to something better. That would be the sensible acceleration.
Well, what you want is for the country to be as good as possible. That's what you want. For if you're self-interested or if you're concerned with moral consistency, what you want is for the country to be as good as possible.
You can say you want a country to be good as possible, but if this
your country, I claim that to be moral, you have to want your country to be as good as possible, and to be pragmatic, you have to want your country to be as good as possible. Right? Because if you cast those aside, then you become someone who's pushing for disaster in your own home.
I don't think that would describe someone like Vladimir Lenin that well. He brought his country to a very low state, but he also brought it back up some way.
Not really. No, I would not say that. He caused his country to be humiliated. He served as an agent for the Germans. He lost a tremendous amount of territory, and in many ways created the conditions for the Second World War. In terms of weakening the Russian state. I'd say that Stalin, you could say that more, but it's not like he was he was doing it the way that you say. He just was ruthlessly prioritizing industrialization and production, and so you could say that he was someone who brought Russia from its knees to its feet in many regards, and with his very tight control, prevented it from collapsing when the Nazis attacked. So there are things that there are merits to Stalin, but to Lenin, in terms of interests of the country, no, I don't think so.
Well, that assumes that the Tsarist path could have provided an alternative way forward, and at least under the rule.
Well, there's no reason to think that the Tsarist path couldn't provide an alternative path forward. Like there's no reason to expect that it was a necessary condition to have this this revolution. 1 second, my headphones are dying, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly go ahead and switch headphones. In the meanwhile, I'll be playing the video.
I don't feel so frivolous anymore. And maybe you've agreed that it's better for your friendship to stop getting into it with each other, but you've just posted on Facebook about how college in America should be free and all student loans forgiven. And your friend has left a comment he's not supposed to leave. And you're not supposed to respond, but you really want to respond. So after a moment's hesitation, you shoot him a DM. Why do you care how we'd afford free tuition? Wars are a lot more expensive than education, but you never seem to care how we pay for those. We just go into debt and you're fine with it. Anyway, aren't you the party that says deficits don't matter?
Yeah, but you're Democrats. You're not going to run a deficit, you're going to raise taxes, aren't you?
Taxes are generally how governments pay for things.
Spoken like a proper socialist.
No socialist would call that socialism. Only you, and only when we pay for things you don't like. But when we build roads or subsidize...
Those are things we can't pay for without governments. But we can pay for college ourselves. We've been doing it since forever.
Well, I hate to tell you this, but it's not the 1950s anymore. Time was you didn't need a degree to get a good job. Now you do. And you could pay for college waiting tables, but now you can't. Nowadays, college is a necessity, and people can't afford it.
Why do liberals make excuses for people? If you want to go to college and don't have the money, then you study and work hard and get a scholarship. You earn it, instead of complaining until somebody gives it to you.
Do you think people aren't doing that? Do you think there's millions of unclaimed scholarships just lying around waiting for someone to apply for them? There is no...
Okay. Great. Okay, so how did the stream go while I was doing that transition? Did you guys miss some of the video? Because that when the headphones were turned off, it might have closed the audio for you. I'll review some comments. Space Time DCR says the left's idea that a less unequal society is generally a happier society, even if it's poorer, is a serious argument. I'm not sure. Because wealth does correlate with happiness, globally. So I don't know about that. I don't think that it's that powerful an argument. And yeah, like it's unhappiness is very highly correlated with chaos, with political chaos, and political chaos does arise from attempts to destroy inequality. So I really don't know about that argument. Mike says, go ahead.
Luke's still on his live stream channel? Is he going back to his other channel, or is he just sticking
No, well, I think that what he finds is that he actually gets more viewers when he's on the Luke Ford live streams channel. So there's no reason for him to go to his main channel and risk it getting banned. There's just absolutely no reason to do that.
Oh, okay.
And let's see if I can get this working. Space Them DCR says wealth is perceived relatively. No, it's not just perceived relatively. There are absolute things that matter. Like your likelihood of experiencing starvation matters in terms of your happiness. It does matter. There are a lot of places that are doing very badly that have high happiness, but that doesn't make the argument that you think it makes. Fletcher says they're going to ask Shapiro extremely cringy questions. My prediction. I hope that Shapiro prepares. I hope he takes this seriously. The notion that you're above the debate is always a very destructive one. And let's see what I can do here. Ian Zin. I can do this. See if I can get this working. Come on. There we go. Okay.
Nowhere near enough financial aid to get everyone to college who needs to go.
That's not my problem. They can crowdfund, or get a loan, or whatever, go on Oprah. The government doesn't owe you an education on my dime.
It's not gonna be your dime. You don't make that much. No one's talking about...
This is the funny thing, right? They say, oh, it's not going to be your dime. But in the end, it is, right? Because the people who you can raise taxes on the most easily are these people, right? These people who the left promises are never going to see their taxes raised. And the left promises that they're going to be helped, that they're going to see a lot of these benefits. But it doesn't go to them, right? It doesn't go to working people overall. It tends to go to people who don't work because they're the ones who need the most. They need way more. People who don't work genuinely need more than people who work. A lot more.
About raising your taxes. If some billionaire you'll never meet gets taxed to put some kid you'll never meet through school, why should you even care?
If somebody robs a bank that...
Right, why should you even care? Because this is the engine of wealth creation, right, that you're trying to undermine here. And because you say you just want to rob the billionaires, but then you proceed to rob people who are quite a lot poorer than that.
It isn't my bank. I'm still opposed to robbery. I have a problem with taking money someone earned to give someone a degree they aren't owed.
Why is what happens to poor people not your problem, but what happens to rich people is? You think you're going to be rich someday?
Oh, please. You're the one who thinks they're going to be rich.
I assure you I do not. But then he says something that blows your mind a little bit. Something that makes you think you've been going about this the wrong way. Something that makes all the seeming contradictions of Republican thought maybe make some kind of sense. He says,
yes, you do. Democrats think they're going to take the money from billionaires and spread it around. Give it to a bunch of poor people so they can go to college, and everyone gets a degree, and everyone gets a good job, and healthcare is free, and minimum wage is $80 an hour, and everyone's saving lots of money. So what then? Everyone's rich. Everyone works in tech, everyone moves to New York and California, and nobody's a billionaire, and nobody's broke, and everyone's great at their job because all they needed was the right opportunity, and no one's better than anyone at anything. It's a fantasy, and we shouldn't have to pay you to LARP it. You think you can make everyone the same, but you can't. There's always a bigger fish.
you say, did you just quote the Phantom fucking Menace at me? And he says,
I guess I did, lol.
Well, that's not where that saying came from. But yeah, there is always a bigger fish, and there is always going to be inequality due to the vast differences in people's natures. An anonymous professor says white dudes need to quit talking about Jews. Well, it doesn't seem to be that productive when they do. But yeah, I mean, I can't be a gatekeeper in principle, and in principle, I think that open discussion has to be allowed. But it just seems like because of the conspiratorial element, it just tends towards pathology so much of the time. And at this point, if I was starting a movement, if I was starting an organization, what I would do, one thing that I would definitely do, is make it so that it's explicitly philo-Semitic. So we get around this sort of crap from the beginning, from the base. It's like, no, we're not welcoming anti-Semites. We're going to be philo-Semitic, and if you're not interested in that, then you don't have to come.
I think if you go that way, you're just going to end up with people who are not going to support everything else about it.
Well, I think that the main thing that I'm going for is eliminating the pathological element. Space Time DCR says... Go ahead.
You need some Pathologism to entertain the ideas of inequality as a good thing, I think, at this point.
I'm not sure about that, but I think that could well be true. But that just decreases the budget that you have, the overhead that you have for more of that, right? So yeah, like maybe you do need, you're going to get people with a certain amount of antisocial bent just because you're talking about the justification for inequality. But that means that in order to stay under a threshold where you're functional, you have to be more picky about the rest of the stuff, not less. Restarting video.
Kyle, you're against the approach of insulting gays, insulting Mexicans, insulting Asians, insulting Jews, and then seizing power?
Yeah.
Like the
Yeah.
Fuentes approach?
Yeah, I don't think that that's the path to power, right? Obviously. When your filtration process is, do you hate this? Yeah. Do you hate this? Yeah. Actually, there's a really good video about that. See if I can find it. Nazi propaganda, Masons, World War II.
I was thinking about this earlier, and it seemed like when obviously Trump won, but it seemed like he was offending so many communities. Eventually, there would be so many people united against him. But he's like the exception to that rule, you know what I mean? And he garnered enough support amongst various factions to win, obviously, where he needed to.
Anyway, there was a video like where some Nazi is giving a speech, and it's like an anti-Nazi video, right? And there's this guy in the crowd, and he's standing next to somebody else, and the guy is saying, "Wow, that sounds right. Wow, that sounds right. Wow, that sounds right." When the speaker is yelling about, "This is bad, and this is bad, and this is bad," and then the speaker says, "And the Masons are bad," and the guy says, "But I'm a Mason." And then there's a lecture where the guy next to him says, "Oh, so you believed everything he said right up until he said something bad about your group." And that's a personality right there. That's a personality of like, "Oh yeah, I'm going to believe it. Oh, give me dish on how terrible this is and how terrible that is and how terrible this is." And that personality is antisocial. Very antisocial. And you can't build a movement out of such people. It's it's like trying to build on foundations of sand. You need people who are reliable, who are good people, people with virtues. Fletcher says, "Cringy as many." Go ahead.
I was going to say it worked better in a society that was like 95% Aryan. If you're insulting the 5% or whatever.
Well, it might even work worse, actually, because it seems like these things work like the kind of the madness of the left is magnified the most in the most homogenous European countries and undercut the most in the most diverse. So I think that actually people become more allergic as they get more distant from hardship to that kind of talk, or more distant from diversity, because the more distant you are from problems, the more mean-spirited it is to bring them up. Fletcher says, "Cringy as many believe it to be, Dave Rubin's attitude towards identity is ideal. Rubin is totally agnostic about it." Anonymous Professor says, "Loving your people is healthy and good in terms of evolutionary psychology. You don't need to hate Jews to love your own people." I agree. And as I said on Luke Ford's show, people who pretend that they love white people but instead mean that they hate everyone else are poison. And yeah, there's nothing wrong with being proud of your heritage. Nothing wrong with being proud of your people, however described, wherever you draw the circle. Now, the problem comes when that's a facade in order to mask antisocial tendencies and hatred. And unfortunately, that's happening a lot. Space MDCR says, "Love of self is inevitably proportionate to hatred of the other," I think. I don't think that that's true at all. I think that that's actually the opposite of true. I think the people who love themselves, who straightforwardly can appreciate and love themselves and their family and their country, they're less likely to fall into pathological hatred of other people. Less likely, not more likely.
It's as good a time as any to drop it, but the conversation sticks with you. See, when you talk to your conservative friend, you operate as though you have the same base assumptions. Belief in democracy, do unto others, etc., etc. If you didn't believe your friend shared these assumptions, you'd basically be calling him a fascist or a sadist. And you conclude that if you believe in democracy, you must believe in equality. And if you believe in equality, you must believe in equal access to education.
Well, this isn't so, right? People believed in democracy without believing in equality. That was the normal way to believe in democracy, actually. Look at how democracy was defined originally, right? So his definition of democracy is not exactly, it's not like pragmatic democracy. It's not any democracy that actually exists. It's rather like an ideal, which is disconnected from reality, and which boils down to, tautologically decomposes down to equality.
Must conclude that governments should help pay tuition. And so you give your friend the benefit of the doubt that if he doesn't understand this very simple logical progression, he either hasn't had it properly explained to him, or has at some point been lied to. Because
This, by the way, I think is really good. I think I disagree with this guy, but he makes a really good video here and a really good point here.
One could believe in all citizens.
That's what always happens, right? Is that there's this assumption that they must be stupid or cartoonishly evil. Maybe he's doing the cartoonishly evil thing, but anyway, there's this assumption that they must be missing something, as opposed to their values are actually different.
Citizens are equal and always a bigger fish at the same time. But by this thinking, you're treating most conservatives as people who want in their hearts to be liberals, but have so far failed. And maybe that's why they think liberals are condescending? What if he doesn't have the same base assumptions as you? Or what if he does, but he has other assumptions you aren't aware of that lead him to different conclusions? He is often misinformed, but what if that isn't the problem? What if he actually believes something else? We've been...
Right. This is the question that ideologues, both on the left and the right, don't ask enough.
Circling around this one for a while. We've talked about what liberals believe, we've talked about what fascists believe, we've talked about what nihilists believe, or rather what they don't believe, or rather why they aren't actually nihilists. But this is a tough one. What do conservatives believe? Oh god, I'm gonna get yelled at so much for this one. The United States, like much of the Western world, is a capitalist democracy. That's what we're raised in, that's what seems normal to us. And in our normal lives, democracy and capitalism seem to coexist easily. Voting doesn't feel like a violation of capitalism, buying a bagel doesn't feel like a violation of democracy. But sometimes they come into tension with one another. And speaking really broadly, when a choice between them has to be made, a liberal is someone who tends to think democratically, and a conservative is someone who tends to think like a capitalist. The operative word here is...
Right. And this opposition is imperfect, right? It's not exactly democracy versus capitalism. You can be very conservative and believe in democracy, right? Democracy as a practice. And you can be very, very conservative and anti-capitalist. But the question is, do you believe that the reason why we have inequality is wickedness? Or do you believe that the reason why we have inequality is differences in virtue? And that doesn't necessarily take you away from democracy or take you towards capitalism. But, it will tend to. But that's not the core here.
Tend. Liberals are still capitalists.
He's going to say that explicitly later on.
And conservatives still stand for democracy, and the preference for one or the other may be very slight. Nevertheless, which way a person leans reveals their priorities. The democratic framework, or at least...
Kane Marco says, I think it's a fair question why we send $38 billion to Israel. $3.8 billion a year, I believe. And yeah, it is a fair question. But of course, there are many other fair questions to ask about U.S. commitments abroad. And the question is, why focus on Israel? But Madam Professor says, maybe I'm wrong, but I'm doing my best to make my own work and reading of literature to help nationalist cause as a race realist. Okay. Other families are part of another aspect of my sense of self, the nation. Right, but space MDCR. I think that confidence in yourself and love of yourself and power make it so that you can engage in win-win scenarios. Like thinking about a game theoretically. You're able to do tit-for-tat with forgiveness, an ideal game theory strategy, only if you can afford to take the betrayal. If you can't, then you're forced to defect from the beginning.
A democratic framework is one citizen, one vote. No matter who you are born with certain in or possibly unalienable rights, and any system that doesn't guarantee you those rights is a tyranny. Freedom, agency, and a hand in the strictures that govern you, everyone is entitled to these things. It's an egalitarian mindset. People gain power by electoral process, i.e., when it is granted to them by the masses, with whom the true power resides, and whom the Constitution guarantees the right to take that power away from an electee, rather than power...
Kane Marco says, but NATO is an occupation force. Right, we see that there's a vast divergence from the conventional wisdom and truth, frankly, when it comes to people's views of foreign policy when they're complaining about Israel, and that's often where one needs to start. Is just like a basic, sane view of these geopolitics. Like, do you believe that if Europe was to like try their best to get America out, America would be like, I'm going to go to war with Germany. I'm going to go to war with these European countries in order to stay there. No, like not in a billion years, my dude. Like, it has not been functionally an occupation force for a very long time.
The elected official is, in a sense, an employee with millions of bosses, all of whom have equal authority. Now, this is the idea of democracy, with the history of democracy being riddled with failures to live up to this ideal. But part of the project of liberalism has been about making the government more closely resemble its ideology. The capitalist framework, by contrast, is that of businesses and markets, where big fish eat the little ones. If two people start businesses in the same field and one makes more profit than the other, that person can make more investments, open more locations, undercut their competitors' prices. The more money you have, the more money you can make. So advantage
Right, but you're a dude. And so other dudes have advantages over you, namely that they're looking at other things and doing other things than you. So yeah, there's an advantage to wealth, but there's also an advantage to being a small fish. You're not noticed as much, right? Like, yeah, like it doesn't boil down to the winner-take-all scenario. And if it did, then, you know, capitalism would not be nearly as productive as it is.
pounds, where even small failures often mean getting muscled out of the field. Now, with some creativity, a novel cost-saving practice, or a new delivery method, the underdog can still thrive, and this is part of what conservatives like about the market, that it demands this creativity in a live ammo environment. But most will not beat the odds. That's how odds work. Since there will...
But you're acting like, yeah, this is the thing, it's like the left acts like making it big is the only thing that matters, and then like the just normal everyday success of working people is disregarded. Like, look at the home ownership rate in America. That represents a lot of normal workaday people carving out a space which is real and incredibly valuable. And you can ignore that, but it's completely disingenuous.
Will always be more failures than successes. The general trajectory of unregulated capitalism is money pooling into fewer and fewer hands. Things naturally sort themselves into a hierarchy with sharks at the top, a million minnows at the bottom. Since we live with both of these frameworks in our minds, and most of the things we do in our day-to-day lives can be justified by either one, we don't often notice the contradictions between them, and it's easy to imagine whichever one tends to be our default is everyone else's default as well. But issues like poverty, taxation, and education are areas where the contradictions matter, and we are sometimes shocked by how different the world looks to our conservative friends. In conservative thinking, this hierarchy is humanity's natural state.
Yep.
The American dream is here, anyone can make it. No matter who you are or what you start with, you can become a billionaire. But a necessary component of this is anyone can, but everyone can't. We're not all going to be billionaires. There's a finite...
Right, and attempts to make everyone the same end up creating gigantic pools of blood and very, very strict hierarchies.
Amount of money in this country. For any one person to have so much more than they need, there must, mathematically, be thousands of people with less.
Kane Marco, maybe later you could join the Discord and discuss why it's so important to integrate economically with Russia relative to America. Like, why is that the move? Integrate with Russia instead of America. Why do you think that that's like the smart economic move here?
It's just the independent move because Russia would have less overall influence on the EU, but I don't think that's really what they want.
Right, in some ways, but in other ways they'd have more because they're more warlike and they're just more warlike. That's enough. the people who are in the modern day taking territory in Europe or Eastern Europe, they're more threatening than America is. Now, I'm not a Russophobe. I'm not anti-Russia, but that has to be recognized that, Russia represents more of a threat, represents more of a restriction in certain ways than America does.
Yeah, well, that's why Poland is definitely not in favor of that idea.
Right.
Friend is often baffled as to what you're even trying to say when you point out there's not enough high-paying jobs or affordable health plans for everyone. There's not supposed to be. The system requires an underclass. Someone's got to clean the toilets. Capitalism then is a proving ground. It's how you demonstrate where in the hierarchy you deserve to be. Do you have more than you need or less? Anything you've got, you beat someone else to it. How resourceful were you? How well did you play? The field is by no means level, but any disadvantage just means you have to work harder. We know people who start with nothing can win big. If you're a shark, you will make your way to the top because that's where you belong. Anyone complaining about how stacked the
Fletcher asks, is this guy a socialist? I believe so, Fletcher. I think he's a hardcore socialist. Mike says they should at least have an option for liquid natural gas. Yeah. I mean, that represents more options. The liquid natural gas, the big liquid natural gas tankers represent a big boon for Europe, fundamentally. They give it more optionality, make it so they can take or leave Russia. Like, that's the move for Europe.
deck is against them is making excuses for not being better at the game. So disadvantage itself is not a problem so long as it's quote-unquote natural.
Get good.
What's necessary is that advantage and disadvantage not be imposed from without. Free tuition, a high minimum wage, taxes on the wealthy, or any other kind of government meddling, these things must be opposed.
Not just government meddling, but meddling from the perspective that that whiners need more as opposed to working people. I'm not sure, Fletcher, how he responds to socialism's repeated failures, particularly on the moral axis.
Opposed, because with them, people would end up in the wrong places. Power has to be earned. If it isn't earned, it won't be properly wielded, and then society ends up a mess. Conservatives generally feel what's wrong with the world today can be chalked up to people not being where they should be in the social order. They used to be where they belonged, but then
Yeah, like partially. Of course, some are reductionist. There are many other issues than who's in the hierarchy where. There are other issues, believe it or not. But, that is a category of issues that exists.
Liberals gummed everything up with their government handouts and forced representation. When exactly things were the way they should be is a bit of a moving target. Nowadays they act like it was the 80s, in the 80s it was the 50s, and in the 50s it was sometime before the New Deal. So following the nostalgia cycle, it's usually about 30 years ago. Conservatives are distrustful of any effort to make society more equal because deep down they don't believe equal societies are real. Obviously, all citizens created equal needs to be the government's.
And how could anyone think that? How could anyone think that equal societies aren't real? What could have ever given people that notion that societies that claim to make everyone the same, everyone equal, aren't real? How could they possibly have come to such a radical and strange conclusion? Could it perhaps have been all the attempts to do that? And how they ended?
Position because you can't trust the government to know where to put
those weren't real attempts to do that. Those weren't real socialism.
People. So it has to treat everyone the same, but this is a legal fiction, like corporate personhood. It just means the government leaves the market alone so the hierarchy can reveal itself. You're not supposed to believe in an equal distribution of power. What are you, 7? This is just the way the world is. Look at alpha wolves, silverbacks. Consider the lobster. You are one single individual within a system, and it is your job to rise or fall within it on the sweat of your own back. You don't change the system. Society's problems come from the rules being too weakly enforced. The answer is always more discipline.
And this does become a caricature of itself sometimes. You can go too far with this. because there is more to the world than hierarchies and arguments about hierarchies and flaws with hierarchies, right? That whole category of things is a big deal, but there are other things in the world, and people often forget that.
Your conservative friend thinks you're naive for thinking the system even can be changed, and his is the charitable interpretation. Many conservatives assume liberals, at least the smart liberals, know that the hierarchy is eternal, that there will always be people at the top and people at the bottom. So any claim towards making things equal must be a Trojan horse for something that benefits them. Why would they?
Yup.
They assume that?
And I don't believe that they believe it. I think that they act it. They feel it and they act it because they're forced to act in that way.
Because that's what they do. The real liberal agenda is to put people in the wrong places on purpose. Boost liberal allies, hold back liberal opposition. You don't want to break up the pyramid. You're just trying to sneak someone else to the top.
True.
A lot of conservative contradictions start to make sense through this.
Although, again, you do want to break up the pyramid, but the way you practice it and the way that you feel in terms of your interactions, that's where you're driven.
This lens of any issue, simply ask, does this distribute power or consolidate it? If power flows up the hierarchy, they're for it. If it flows down, they're against.
Well, it is weird. So Mike says, like, people who say I'm doing it for the white race, it just seems weird. Yeah, so I'll provide a counter argument. Like, when do you see any sub-Saharan Africans say they're doing it for all sub-Saharan Africans? When do you see any East Asians say they're doing it for all East Asians? Chinese saying, oh, well, what I'm doing is, of course, equally for Japanese people and Koreans and Vietnamese people. It's not something that you see in the world, right? So when it's this sort of weird category that only has very specific people with very specific views, endorsing it in this context, particularly when you're talking about, a view of white that just goes around Jews, well, at that point, like, it is inherently tied to an attempt to what you hate, what you dislike. Right, that's the problem. The problem is with the specifics of white identity and how white identity is formulated. Like, they're not formulating it as a cluster of ethnicities that's mathematically determined. Right? They're formulating it in a way that reflects what they don't like. And that's quote-unquote white to them. And it's an odd thing to organize around, because people don't organize around that, broadly speaking. They don't go, oh, East Asian? Well, okay, I'm on your side because I'm Chinese. Right, but anonymous professor, do you see a world where, like, there's a Caucasoid imperium, or there's like a white, like all the white people are together, all the white ethnicities, like analogous to like Japan and China and Korea and Vietnam all uniting? Do you see that happening? Because I don't see it happening. Right? And if it's not happening, then there are other categories that are more germane. Well, Fletcher, who are these Pan-Asian groups, right? And what sort of cachet do they have relative to Chinese nationalists, Japanese nationalists, Korean nationalists? In terms of the Africans, there's some of that, but I don't see a great deal of solidarity there either. There are numerous academics who suspect that white identity will be legit in the future. It depends what's meant by it, right? Like, yeah, like the reason why it's hard to be to talk about that categorization without being creepy is that people who do it are so often motivated, and so often in their conception of it is revealed that they're doing it to express some sort of antipathy or sympathy with a certain European ideology. Okay, identifying with their Asianness is one thing, but in terms of conceiving themselves as a united frontier, that's different. Like La Raza. Okay, there's La Raza. There's also like the incredible violence done to Mexican immigrants by Hispanics who are here already, right? There's a huge amount of violence that goes on in jails and resentment that goes on between different Latin communities, between the Puerto Ricans and the Mexicans, between the people with green cards and those without. I don't know. Yeah, like that's the thing, right? And those who do, by the way, what about those who do, right? What about your Pan-Africans when they exist? Like the people who came up with the Yaqub, the Yaqub theory, the Nation of Islam, right? What were they? They were pathological. What about the Pan-Hispanic, the La Raza people? What are they? They're pathological. They're oppositionalist. Right? Anonymous professor says, white identity does not mean anti-Jew because it was true in the past doesn't mean it will always be true in the future. Even moderates like White Shift author make that claim. Well, sure, but it's about the problem is baked into the definitions, right? So what I favor, and it can be called white identity and it will be called white identity by certain people. What I want is for people to recognize and have pride in the achievements of their ancestors and the reflection of that in themselves. Not just white people, but everyone. I want them to understand that the achievements of their ancestors are in many respects reflected in themselves. And that success is nothing to be ashamed of, right? I want that to be understood. And that applies to everyone, right? Okay. It's particularly germane in the case of the U.S. With whites who feel guilty about their success. Okay. That's healthy. Now, once it starts to be about excluding and about hating, then it ceases to be healthy, in my opinion. Yeah, it is a hard problem, Anon. Yeah, it's very hard. It's very hard to nail down. It's a very hard subject.
Al, are you worried about the Groyper army coming onto your show and
No.
trying to shut shit down? Once
Yeah,
you
but
get shut down by Crenshaw and others, maybe you're next in line.
Yeah, I'll engage with anyone, but yeah, I'm not afraid certainly of the Groypers. Kane Marco says, shouldn't people exclude others? Yeah, Kane Marco, people should exclude others, but there are these things called nations, and I think people should be loyal to their countrymen. I think that's a very useful concept, and if you are trying to get large swaths of your country kicked out or abused, then you're not meeting that bar.
Is what Trump is doing to immigrants right now abusing his countrymen?
No.
Or is it not under that line because they haven't yet been naturalized by the next Democratic president?
So, first of all, there has to be provisions for people who break the law, regardless of whether they're your countrymen or not. You can punish them in various ways, including by expulsion. But second of all, like citizens matter. Citizenship matters. So it matters whether someone is a citizen or not. Like that's very crucial.
Does it matter if the next president after Trump is a Democrat and naturalizes every illegal immigrant? Can the next Republican president say that was illegitimate?
Probably not. It's very difficult once people become citizens to call their citizenship illegitimate. It becomes a very slippery slope, and that's why you need to be very careful about who you invite in and who you naturalize, right?
So you need to exclude and be hateful.
No, it's not about being hateful. I'm not being hateful by not letting people into my house. But if I have an apartment complex and I rent it out, and then suddenly I decide, no, I don't want these people in there anymore, and I stand with a gun at the door and I say, no, you can't come back into the house that you've rented. I'm cutting off the deal right now. Then that's a betrayal. right? So those are the differences. It's like if it's your house, it's your house. If you rented it out, then you have a certain obligation that goes along with that. And so citizenship represents kind of a tiny piece of ownership over the country, and you can't just take it back once you've given it. It's a very it's a momentous thing to give away, or it's a momentous thing to award, and that needs to be recognized. And if you don't recognize that, that's on you, not on the people who made the deal with you.
Well, it's too late to argue about that because it's going to happen as soon as any Republican executive loses the election.
Well, we'll see,
It's
first of
going to
all.
be-
But second of all, yeah, like, it's likely that the illegals who are here, the lion's share of them are going to become citizens, or the children are going to be citizens, and that's going to happen, right? That's why you need to make sure that the border is secure. You pay a price for not securing the border.
Yes, but it's weird to see you talk about the future of, we need to stop the next batch.
Yeah.
Like the one we have already isn't bad enough.
Oh, yeah. The one we have already is not bad enough in the sense that the one we have already does not bring us to any sort of floor. Things can get vastly, vastly worse than where they are now. Vastly worse. We're not even close to rock bottom. I'm going to restart the video.
Against it. How can conservatives say 15 an hour is too much for flipping burgers, but somehow 11.5 million an hour isn't too much to run Amazon?
So confusing. How could anyone believe that?
Because if you're flipping burgers, you're a minnow, and you don't need 15 an hour to be a minnow. But sharks, they deserve all they can get, because they know what to do with it. They use it to give us Amazon. Don't you want Amazon? We keep assuming conservatives defend the rich because they think they'll be rich someday. And sure, they would love to be, but it's more nuanced than that. They defend the rich because they believe the rest of us need the rich. We'd be lost without them. There should be no shame.
True.
Shame in being beneath the rich, not if the right people are rich. No shame in being a cog in the machine so long as the machine produces something beautiful. There is a real fear that every...
Yep. That's called good character. If you need to be on top of the world all the time, and that is what you envision when you flatten society, is everyone being on top. Yeah, like, that's bad character to need to have that level of prominence. You need to recognize that often you're going to be serving other people's visions. And how do you expect to make your own visions real without other people doing the same for you? Just detached from reality.
Everyone filling their prescribed role is the only thing keeping us from complete and total, not the fun kind, of anarchy. There is honor in being in your place and doing your best with it, most especially if your place isn't at the very bottom. The thing about hierarchies is they're self-similar on many scales.
Fletcher says, if I had to press Conservatism Inc. on one issue, it would be deportation. I would say it would be on border security and on e-verify, things that make it harder for illegals to work. Sanctuary cities, that's where I would focus, because that's where it seems like there's room to change. The deportation thing would be further along. You'd have to slice a lot off the salami before that becomes the issue at hand. But yeah, the law should be enacted in principle. And it is astounding and terrible that it's not being enacted.
If you're in the middle, then you serve the king, Valardohyrus. But to everyone beneath you, you are the king. You've got a good job and a good wage, that gives you some power over people who don't. And getting pissed at those above implies that those below have a right to be pissed at you. And there's a real anxiety that liberals want to make room for those people in the middle by putting conservatives at the bottom, and that those people will treat conservatives the way conservatives treated them. Freedom, respect, and empathy are looked on as finite resources in a competitive market, just like jobs and scholarships.
And they are.
Also, most conservatives are white men, and so are most billionaires. So, but for the wealth, they actually have a lot in common, which makes it easy to empathize with billionaires and to feel empowered by seeing...
And that's the lefty smear right there. No. That's not what's behind this. It's not racial affinity. It's recognition of virtue, recognition of greatness, which also applies if you see greatness from someone who doesn't share your race. I see endless amounts of white people praising the likes of Sun Tzu. It's not the case that they can't recognize greatness from elsewhere. Like, it's just not so.
People like oneself do so well, and white men at the top influence policy in ways that serve people like them.
Fletcher says, leftist views on whites are akin to alt-right views on Jews. They're pretty much exactly the same.
Them, which materially
the
benefits
views on
white men.
whites are more respectable in leftist circles or just in general.
I didn't hear that.
The views on whites are more respectable both to the leftist circles and the general populace.
Agreed. Yeah, for sure.
In the middle, the well-being of the white billionaire becomes a metonym for the well-being of all white men. A slight on them is a slight on all of us. White men want to believe that these billionaires earned their station, and not that their gender or race got them preferential treatment, because that would
want to believe. They understand that they earned their position.
imply their own treatment may have also been biased in their favor, and maybe it's not the liberals giving people power they don't deserve. No matter how much a conservative believes in earning one's place, they have always in the back of their mind an image of what society should look like, and any discrepancy between imagination and observation must mean foul play. This feminist is too respected, this black superhero is too popular. Can't be because they're worthy. Someone must have put their hand on the scales.
This woman can't be a genius. Someone must have put their hand on the scale. How irrational.
Someone got a freebie, or played the race card, or faked a scandal. This means even though they claim the hierarchy is natural, what they will or won't accept as legitimate is a gut feeling. If they like what they see, they take credit for it.
As opposed to you, whose views have nothing to do with gut feelings about how terrible it is to have to be a cog in someone else's machine.
If they don't, it's the left's fault.
How terrible to be a cog in someone else's machine. How terrible to be useful to someone else's vision. What a terrible fate.
And what does it say about them that they see a bunch of white male sharks and think, yeah, that's authentic? The innate authenticity of wealth and power is the starting point. Like, okay, bear with me. You know when they open the door to Kingdom Hearts, and on the other side there's Mickey with his shirt off, and you're like, why would Mickey with his shirt off be on the other side of that door? And the answer is, I don't know, we'll figure it out in like 7 games. Rich people believing it's good for everyone that I'm rich is the starting assumption. That's Mickey with his shirt off. And conservatism is...
And of course, for you, the starting assumption is that it isn't good for everyone. Starting assumption is that, in fact, the only objective way we have to tell whether someone is virtuous or not without appealing to these sort of subjective judgments is just how well they do. Right? That's our objective measure. Why should that be systematically biased? Right? Compared to your ad hoc reasoning based on your feelings of how much people deserve.
Is the pile of games where they make up reasons why that might be true after the fact. It's a retcon. This hierarchy is not democratic.
You're the one retconning, my dude. You're the one who has to avoid the screaming examples of your philosophy's failures.
It's birth by sleep, a fragmentary passage. Savvy viewers may be remembering another political philosophy that is hierarchical, undemocratic, built on nostalgia, and that likes to cloak its policies in progressive camouflage, and that's the one from 2 videos ago. Fascism. Oh, golly. Now, I am not calling conservatives fascists. There are distinctions. Under fascism, the hierarchy is much, much less meritocratic, and the nostalgia is much, much older. However, conservative thinking is, at the very least, one that fascism maps more cleanly onto. Fascists appeal to this hierarchical mindset by portraying all of history as struggles between ethnic groups over who gets to be where. Someone's got to be at the bottom, white man. We'll make sure it isn't you. You'll find throughout history that fascist movements, though they often pick up dissidents from all over the political spectrum, the third position, for instance, is fascism for anti-capitalists, when they find purchase in a political party, it's pretty much always the conservative party. Look at France, look at Brazil, look at here. Whether you want to interpret that as conservatism being uniquely susceptible to fascists, or diet fascism being another name for conservatism, I leave that up to you. Fascism, and to an extent libertarianism, are roided up extrapolation.
Diet fascism is conservatism. Such a slimy take. Such a weird, such a contrived take given, especially his later video or earlier video where he was talking about the origins of conservatism. Like, it's much older. The skepticism of utopian leftist dreams is much older than fascism.
Of the hierarchical mindset, in the same way socialism and anarchy are extrapolations of the egalitarian one. We can see conservatism as a kind of compromise between fascism and democracy, and liberalism as a kind of compromise between capitalism and socialism. They are two different attempts to solve the tensions between these ways of thinking without giving either one up. You could just as easily claim that liberalism is watered-down, ineffectual socialism. A lot of the left would balk at that, but not me, pinko scum that I am. The most important thing to understand is that you cannot communicate with nor anticipate the behaviors of a conservative if you don't understand what they believe, which is hard because they're often in denial. You will never convince them to compromise on any attempt to break up the hierarchy because even incremental change strikes them as revolutionary, and they feel they've made too many concessions already. You will never get them of their own free will to agree to government regulation because the government as a democratic institution is inherently unnatural. If you don't like what a business is doing, you don't regulate it. You take your money elsewhere. You should favor the capitalist solution, not the democratic one. Also, when you vote with your dollar, people with more dollars get more votes.
Another insidious thing is the slamming together of communism and democracy that happens conceptually here. No, not the same thing.
They will never be on board with aiding the poor in any systemic way and will instead champion charity and crowdfunding because minnows getting to eat should always be framed as a gift rather than a right. You may get individual conservatives.
Yep, if you can't make your way, charity is great, but it should be labeled as charity.
To come around on some of these, but as a body, they will never consent to any of it unless they can work it to their advantage, or if you have leverage over them. They will sign on when denying progressivism costs them something, because few things terrify them more than slipping down the hierarchy. And what's insidious is that most of us have this thinking ingrained in our own minds as well, myself included. We're all raised in the same culture. This is why they're able to...
It's cultural, guys. It's just cultural programming. That's what's causing us to think this way. It's the cultural programming. If we just got rid of that, everything would be so much better.
Control the conversation, because they can with some...
Maybe we could have camps to remove that brainwashing.
Priming, get us thinking in their terms. A nice upshot is our thinking is also ingrained in their minds, though they're a little bit better at fighting it. But as long as you're trying to meet this mentality in the middle, you are leaving the door open for fascists. Conservatism is, and always will be, vulnerable to them. A good defense against fascism is to consciously, intentionally, think and act in democratic terms. Because, newsflash, we're not actually lobsters. Neither of these systems is...
We're not lobsters. Good news! Biology has nothing to do with us. That Jordan Peterson point about that the neurochemical commonalities, we can just dismiss it. We're not lobsters, guys. We're not. We don't have to care about biology at all. That's just a fascist lie.
Natural. They are choices we can make. I recommend this one because egalitarian thinking is one thing Nazis are bad at infiltrating. If you want to fight fascism, move left.
Yeah, Nazis are terrible at infiltrating egalitarian thinking. Yeah, they're terrible at taking advantage of the resentment of the unsuccessful, the resentment of the worker, the resentment of the criminal, right? Terrible at doing that. Just terrible. All right, that was a good set of video reviews. Hope y'all enjoyed. I certainly did. And I hope that I can maybe get some more people on my Discord. Y'all can join my Discord. I'm going to post the link one more time. I'm going to create a call to action. My bros, join the Discord. You won't regret it. Discord is a place to talk even if I can't stream. So, recommend you join. And good night, everyone.